Viewers, before diving into this wild tale, take a moment and drop your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is watching from. Now picture this. Garrett, a widower, still reeling from the loss of his wife, floats quietly on his spring-fed lake as the sunset paints the water in gold. The loons call across the mist, crickets sing from the pine line, and for a moment the world feels still. Then the shriek of police sirens shatters that peace, echoing through the trees like a buzzsaw slicing silk. Deputy Martinez climbs from his cruiser ticket book in hand, and behind him stands Karen Whitmore, arms folded, lips curved into that plastic smile that says she smells victory before it even arrives. The charge, $1,000 fine for swimming in his own lake, a lake that had been in Garrett's family for 3 generations before her subdivision even existed. Garrett is dripping wet, holding that ridiculous citation, and thinking this is what happens when you let power-drunk people dig through dusty ordinances no one has read since the 1920s. See, he hadn't spent 20 years as a county finance director for nothing. He knew how local governments worked, how forgotten rules could be weaponized, like museum relics turned into blunt instruments. Historians still argue whether bureaucrats invent red tape to protect communities or just to keep themselves employed, but Garrett had seen enough to know the latter was closer to the truth. Karen's arrival had been like a hurricane in stilettos. Within 6 months of moving into her freshly built McMansion, she had wrangled herself into the HOA presidency. She brought store-bought cookies that smelled of preservatives more than kindness, walked gravel driveways in shoes designed for catwalks, and always found a way to slip in a comment about upgrading the neighborhood. She wasn't neighborly, she was casing the place like a shark circling the water. And when Garrett turned down her laughable lowball offer to buy his land, the real war began. The harassment dripped like a leaky faucet. Complaints about his dock accusations, about contaminated trout, whispers about dangerous water usage. County inspectors came and went, each time shaking their heads at how clean his lake was, almost apologizing for wasting his time. But Karen wasn't after the truth, she was after control. And she'd found an old ordinance about recreational permits near residential zones, convinced her realtor buddies on the commission to retroactively amend it, and declared herself queen of his water. Garrett knew he was staring down a classic petty tyrant with too much free time and not enough wisdom. The day she marched up his drive with a so-called county inspector named Randy Clipboard shaking in his sweaty hands, Garrett almost laughed. The man demanded a business license for commercial fishing, claiming his 50 stock trout were evidence of a secret aquaculture empire. Garrett played polite, showed his papers, then later dug into Randy's credentials and discovered they had expired years ago. This was no inspector, this was a fraud. Garrett screenshotted everything, filed complaints, and began unraveling threads that would soon trap Karen in her own web. Like crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt, one of those quirky ideas people swore by until history proved it ridiculous, Karen thought she'd discovered the perfect weapon in bureaucracy. But Garrett knew the system better than she ever could. Her petty fine was just the opening act, and in trying to drown him, she'd only awakened the wrong man to fight back. Garrett had seen fraudsters crumble before, and Randy Morrison was no different. Within a week of Garrett's complaint, the state licensing board was breathing down Randy's neck, threatening $10,000 fines and maybe even criminal charges. Word spread fast in a small county. By the time Randy called Karen in a panic, begging her to fix it, Garrett was sipping coffee on his porch, watching mist curl off the lake like spirits escaping into the dawn. He knew the smell of desperation, cheap cologne, and polyester when it came rumbling up his gravel drive. Karen showed up waving a fresh bill, claiming he now owed $3,000 in backdated liability insurance for swimming in his own lake. It was audacious enough to be funny, like charging someone rent for breathing their own air. But Garrett wasn't laughing. He'd spent too many years with municipal budgets to let her scam fly. He filed for an injunction in county court citing property rights precedent from Lucas v. South Carolina, a landmark case that made clear governments couldn't strip landowners of all beneficial use without compensation. Historians still argue whether that case tilted too far toward property owners or not far enough, but one thing was certain: it gave Garrett leverage, and just in case, he hired a surveyor. That survey came back like a Christmas present. Karen's beloved subdivision encroached 15 feet onto state forest land. 3 homes were trespassing, including one belonging to her cousin. Garrett tipped off the forestry department anonymously, knowing the potential fines would make her petty charges look like pocket change. Karen's response was pure theatrics. She stormed across his lawn screaming about property values while Garrett calmly handed her court papers for the upcoming hearing. Her shrieks scattered the loons and probably woke the dead in the next county. But she wasn't done. Days later, she brought Channel 7 News to his driveway, trying to paint him as an ecological menace. Garrett, unruffled, poured a glass straight from his lake, drank it on camera, and produced inspection reports thicker than a phone book. The look on Karen's face, like someone realizing they'd brought a squirt gun to a tank fight, was priceless. From there, the dominoes began to fall. Her lies unraveled under Megan Torres's sharp questioning, and Garrett hinted at her shady past in California and Arizona. Soon the story shifted, neighbors started whispering, and Karen's plastic mask began to crack. When she filed a complaint about his septic system, the inspector she summoned praised Garrett's composting setup as an eco-friendly model, even asking for his contractor's number. When she tried legal intimidation with a 600-an-hour law firm, Garrett countered by digging through HOA financials. What he found made his blood hum. Contracts steered to her husband's landscaping company for inflated amounts. Pool maintenance daily, but billed while service was only weekly. Legal fees covering her personal divorce attorney. It was the kind of corruption Garrett had spotted in city halls for decades, and Karen had left a paper trail wider than the county highway. Meanwhile, she filed a restraining order against him, claiming he was stalking HOA members. In court, Garrett's lawyer, Patricia, shredded the lies with audio recordings and security footage until the judge flipped the script, issuing a protective order against Karen instead. Like alchemists once believed lead could be turned into gold, Karen believed harassment could be turned into authority. Garrett knew better. He had binders of evidence, a lawyer who smiled like a wolf before breakfast, and decades of practice watching fraudsters hang themselves with their own rope. The balance was shifting fast. By the time Karen moved an HOA meeting into her garage, a space barely fit for storing bicycles, let alone democracy, neighbors had reached their breaking point. Standing outside in October chill, they muttered about her tactics while Garrett quietly held his binder of evidence waiting. Patricia, his attorney, cited bylaws demanding a proper venue, and when residents voted to relocate back to the community center, Karen called the police. Deputy Martinez arrived, sighed like a man who wished he were anywhere else, and reminded everyone this was civil business. That sigh carried more authority than Karen's entire tantrum. Inside the community center, the tide turned. Bob the accountant unveiled charts showing tens of thousands siphoned to Karen's family. Janet, the retired teacher, read testimonies of harassment so absurd they drew laughter. Bird baths, fined garden gnomes, outlawed pool parties shut down for noise. Lisa, the engineer, exposed drainage violations that could trigger environmental shutdowns. Garrett bided his time, then produced the HOA charter clause Karen had overlooked. His lake property fell inside the buffer zone, granting him voting rights. And because his parcel carried more assessed value than most, he now held 31% of the HOA's power. Karen's scream of, "You don't even live here," was answered by Patricia's calm legal declaration. He was now not just a member, but the single largest voting bloc. What followed was like theater. Karen lashed out, dredging up Garrett's grief, calling him unstable, weaponizing his wife's death. The room froze. Neighbors saw her cruelty laid bare. For years she'd masked herself as a guardian of property values, but now her face cracked like old porcelain. Residents who once kept quiet began speaking. One by one, they told stories of intimidation and petty fines, voices quivering with anger and relief. It was as though a dam burst and years of fear came rushing out. Karen tried to adjourn, but no one moved. Garrett advanced to the podium, binders stacked like bricks of truth. "I'm not here to destroy this community," he said evenly. "I'm here to save it." Behind him, Channel 7's cameras rolled, catching every word. The financial irregularities flashed on screen. Then the Myrtle Beach condo purchased with HOA funds. Then her criminal history from 3 other states. Historians still argue whether public shaming has any place in modern governance, but in that packed hall, it was pure justice. When the county prosecutor stood and declared charges of embezzlement and fraud, Karen shrieked, stumbled in her designer heels, and was led away in handcuffs. Even her U-Haul parked outside betrayed her guilt, stuffed with stolen HOA property. What followed wasn't just Garrett's victory. It was a neighborhood's rebirth. Karen's husband fled Randy, the fake inspector pleaded out, and a new board was elected with Bob, Janet, and Lisa at the helm. Garrett declined office, preferring his dock and the loon song, but he offered advice whenever asked. The HOA became transparent budgets, posted online contracts, bid fairly, rules rewritten to encourage community instead of crush it. Within months, property values rose, not because of stricter control, but because neighbors finally trusted each other again. 6 months later, Garrett sat on his dock as children splashed in the water once weaponized against him. Sarah's old chipped mug warmed his hands, now filled with fresh coffee, while laughter carried across the lake. The place that had been his refuge in grief had become the heart of a healed community. And when calls came from other towns desperate for help against their own Karens, Garrett picked up ready to share his playbook. Because he'd learned something timeless: tyrants thrive on silence, but when ordinary people stand together with receipts and resilience, justice isn't a maybe, it's inevitable. The wind down came slowly like dusk rolling over the water. His voice softened, no longer sharp with battle, but gentle with reflection. He told listeners that grief never fully leaves. It lingers like mist on a morning lake, but it can be transformed into something that serves others. He pictured Sarah's smile in every ripple, imagined her pride in every neighbor's laugh, and let the moment stretch long. The lake that had once been his private sanctuary now belonged to many, not in deed, but in spirit, and he welcomed that. So he lingered in the quiet trout, circling below voices echoing faintly from the new community cookout, and whispered to himself, and maybe to Sarah, that the fight had been worth it. Because sometimes when the noise fades and the loons return to sing, peace doesn't just visit, it settles in.